Lord Theobald of the Silver Spire, his face a mask of bored perfection, looked down from the ridge. His armor, forged of starlight and song, was so bright it hurt the human eye. Below, in the mud of the Valley of Sighs, stood the human army, a pathetic collection of soot-stained peasants in mismatched leather and dull iron. They were terrified. You could smell the sweat and fear from 100 paces. Theobald's perfect lips curled into a sneer of utter contempt. His gaze fell upon their front rank, and for the first time in 1,000 years, the elven lord truly laughed. The sound was like breaking glass, beautiful and cold. "General Amaury," Theobald's voice echoed across the valley, amplified by magic. "You were told to bring tribute, not firewood." He gestured at the front line of human soldiers, each nervously holding a crude black iron tube mounted on a wooden plank. "Are you so primitive you believe you can frighten us with noise and smoke? You mortals are even duller than I imagined. This is not a child's festival. This is a battlefield." The elven lines, a perfect wall of silver and blue, shimmered with contained magic. Amaury, his own face grim and streaked with grease, ignored the taunt. His eyes found his apprentice, Solène, in the front rank. She looked back, nodded once, and turned her gaze to the elves. Amaury's hand trembled, not from fear, but from the terrible weight of what he was about to do. He raised his unadorned steel sword, the cold morning air burning his lungs, and roared a single, hoarse word. "Line!" We'll find out what happens next in just a moment. But first, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France. I want to know. Don't just sit back. Tell me where in the world you are. Now let's get back to the story. It had all begun 3 months ago in the great drafty hall of King Leonce of Braille-la-Forêt. The king was a good man, which meant he was a poor king. He was slumped on his wooden throne, his face gray. Before him stood the elven emissary, all grace and casual cruelty, idly inspecting a perfect white fingernail. The emissary had delivered the ultimatum. The elves of Cerulean claimed the entire Tanglewood forest, the last great resource of the human kingdom. They were to evacuate it by the next full moon or be cleansed. It was not a negotiation. It was a sentence. When the king had protested, the elf had simply smiled. "Your kind lives for a flicker," the elf had said, his voice a bored sigh. "Why do you cling so tightly to the inevitable? You are temporary. We are eternal." The humiliation hung in the air, thick and choking, long after the elf had vanished in a shimmer of blue light. The king had summoned his war council, which consisted of old, scarred men who knew how to fight orcs, but not elves. Elves were magic. Elves were immortal. Elven arrows never missed, and elven magic could turn a phalanx of soldiers to ash before they ever got close. The council chamber was suffocating with despair. It was then that Amaury, the royal artificer and master of the forge, had been summoned. He was not a lord or a general. He was a smith, a man whose hands were permanently black with soot and grease. He stood on the polished stone floor, a dirty thumbprint on his cheek, as the king explained the situation. The lords and generals looked at him with pity. What could a smith do? King Leonce, however, just looked tired. "Amaury," the king whispered, his voice cracking. "They see us as insects. They think we are primitive. Is there anything in that forge of yours that can humble a god?" Amaury was a practical man. He did not believe in gods, and he had his doubts about elves. He had spent his life studying not magic, but reaction. The way steel folded, the way heat traveled, the way pressure could be contained, and the way, when it could not be contained, it sought escape. He thought of the great cannons he had been designing, siege engines to break castle walls. Too slow, too heavy.
The elves were fast. They would never be caught in a siege. No, he needed something else. He needed a cannon that a man could carry. A weapon that was not elegant. A weapon that was loud and dirty and mortal. A weapon that spat in the eye of perfection and announced humanity's brutal, chaotic arrival. He looked at the despairing faces of the lords, at the terror in his good king's eyes, and he felt a cold, righteous fury take root in his heart. His mind went to his apprentice, Solène. She was a brilliant girl, barely 18, with a mind that saw the world in angles and forces. She was the one who had helped him perfect the new casting technique for the cannons. She was not just bright, she was fearless. While he was the artisan, she was the reckless scientist. She was the one who had read the forbidden texts from the East, the ones that spoke of black sand and fire lances. He had dismissed them as fantasy, alchemical nonsense. But now, in this moment of absolute despair, with the laughter of the elven emissary still echoing in his ears, Amaury looked at his king. "Perhaps, your majesty," Amaury said, his voice quiet but rough as gravel. "I do not have a weapon to fight magic, but I might have an idea, and it begins not with magic, but with sulfur, charcoal, and saltpeter." King Leonce, his eyes hollow, had seized on this one flickering ember of hope. "Do it!" King Leonce commanded. "Do whatever it takes. Spare no expense. You have until the next full moon." The generals and lords had looked at Amaury with disbelief. Some scoffed. A smith? With sand? But Amaury simply bowed. He walked out of the great hall, the weight of his entire kingdom settling onto his broad, soot-stained shoulders. He went straight to the forge, where Solène was sketching a new gear system in the dirt. "Solène," he said, his voice grim, "stop what you're doing. I need you to find every text we have on the fire lances of the East, and then I need you to bring me every barrel of sulfur we have in the city." Solène's eyes, usually so bright with humor, widened with a terrible, thrilling understanding. "Master," she breathed, Are we really going to do it?" Amaury just nodded, his face black. "We are going to make thunder."
The forge became a fortress of secrecy. The clanging of hammers, usually a rhythm of creation and commerce, became a frantic, desperate beat. Amaury and Solène worked in the sealed back room, a place normally reserved for Amaury's most delicate silverwork. Now it was a den of stinking chemicals and dangerous equations. The black sand was not a legend. It was a recipe, a precise, volatile, and utterly terrifying recipe. They ground the charcoal from blessed willow trees, purified the sulfur from the deepest hot springs, and refined the saltpeter from the ancient, bat-filled caves beneath the city. They were not smiths anymore. They were alchemists, walking a razor's edge between salvation and disaster. The first few batches had been pathetically weak, fizzling out in a puff of disappointing, smelly smoke. "More air," Solène had insisted, her face smudged with black. "It needs to breathe." They tried again. This time, they corned the powder, mixing it into a wet paste with stale wine, forcing it through a sieve and letting it dry into tiny, uniform granules. Each granule now held its own perfect balance of fuel and air. Amaury, his hands shaking slightly, took a pinch of the new corned powder, no bigger than his thumbnail, and placed it on the anvil. Solène stood back, holding a heavy leather shield just in case. Amaury took a long steel poker, heated its tip in the forge until it glowed bright orange, and touched it to the tiny black pile. The result was not a fizzle. It was a bang, a sharp, deafening crack that rattled every tool on the wall and sent a shockwave through the stone floor. A brilliant flash of white-hot light filled the room, and the anvil rang like a church bell. Amaury was thrown back, his ears ringing, a giddy, terrified laugh bubbling in his chest. It worked. Now they needed to contain that bang.
They needed the stick. Amaury, a master metallurgist, knew that the elven steel his king's army used was useless. It was too light, too perfect. It was designed to sing, to hold a delicate edge. He needed steel that was brutish. He needed thick, heavy, ugly iron. He and Solène worked the forges themselves, their apprentices sworn to secrecy, casting the first barrels. They were not swords, elegant and tapered. They were tubes, thick-walled, crudely welded, and reinforced with heavy iron bands. They were the ugliest things Amaury had ever made in his life, and he loved them more than any masterpiece. He mounted the first tube onto a rough-hewn plank of oak, drilled a tiny touch hole near the back, and looked at Solène. "This," he said, his voice full of awe, "is the demon stick. Now we see if it is a weapon or a bomb." They took the first prototype to the city's deep quarry, far from prying eyes. They loaded it with a heavy measure of the black sand, wadded a piece of greasy cloth on top, and then rammed a crude half-pound lead ball down the barrel. They propped it on a boulder, aiming it at the quarry wall 100 yards away. Solène, with her steady hand, held a burning taper. "Ready, master?" she asked, her voice trembling with excitement. "Fire the demon," Amaury whispered. She touched the taper to the touch hole. There was a spark, a hiss, and then an earth-shattering boom that echoed off the quarry walls like the voice of an angry god. A massive cloud of white, stinking smoke completely obscured the target. They fanned it away, coughing, their ears screaming in protest. And they saw it. There, in the solid granite wall, was a new, fist-sized crater 3 inches deep. The lead ball had not just hit the wall, it had punched it. Amaury stared at the hole, his mind reeling. An elven bow, with its magical force arrows, could chip that stone. A human longbow would be lucky to scratch it. This thing, this ugly, loud, smoky stick, had delivered a blow of almost unimaginable, brutal force. Solène was the first to speak, her voice a hushed whisper of pure reverence. They're never going to see this coming." Amaury, however, felt a sudden, cold dread mix with his triumph. He looked at the smoking, blackened tube, now dangerously hot to the touch. He thought of the noise, the violence, the sheer primitive fury of the explosion. He had set out to make a weapon to save his people. He realized in that moment that he had unleashed something on the world that could never be put back. He had made a monster, and now he had to make 500 more.
The victory in the quarry was short-lived. The first prototype was a success. The next 5 were catastrophic failures. One barrel, cast with a microscopic flaw in the iron, exploded on the testing range, sending lethal iron shrapnel screaming in every direction, shredding the wooden dummy they had placed behind it. Another stick fired, but the lead ball only dribbled out of the barrel, falling to the ground 10 feet away, while the explosion blew backwards out of the touch hole, nearly blinding the test dummy. Amaury was frantic. The deadline of the full moon was a ticking clock. Every failure was a day lost. Every exploding barrel was a life that would be lost on the battlefield. The forge became a place of gallows humor and raw nerves. "Which way do we point the dangerous end, master?" one of the smiths joked, and was met with stony silence. Solène was the one who kept him sane. While Amaury obsessed over the metallurgy, she obsessed over the process. "It's the powder, master," she insisted, holding up 2 different granules. "This batch is too fine. It burns too fast. It detonates. This one is too coarse. It burns too slow. It fizzles." She became a master of the black sand, her hands and face permanently stained, her notes filled with frantic, brilliant calculations. She was the one who figured out the precise optimal grain size. She was the one who developed the matchlock, a simple S-shaped lever that would hold a slow-burning cord or match, allowing a soldier to fire the stick with a simple pull, rather than a clumsy, handheld taper. She was making it better. She was making it deadly. Then came the day of the first live test. They had built 10 new sticks using Amaury's new thicker barrel design and Solène's matchlock mechanism. They needed a real soldier to fire it, someone who could tell them how it felt. They chose a grizzled old sergeant named Uden, a man who had survived a dozen border skirmishes and trusted nothing but his own spear arm. Uden looked at the black iron stick with profound suspicion. "You want me to hold this thunder pipe next to my face?" he growled. "Aye," Amaury said. "It's simple. You pour in the powder, you ram in the ball, you put a pinch of powder in this pan, you pull this, and you hold on." Uden sighed, muttered a prayer to his ancestors, and did as he was told. He shouldered the heavy stick, aimed at a shield 50 yards away, and pulled the glowing match cord into the pan. The crack was deafening. Uden was knocked flat on his back, his shoulders screaming in pain from the recoil, his beard singed, but he was alive. And 50 yards away, the heavy oak shield, banded with steel, had a ragged, tennis ball-sized hole blown clean through its center. Uden just lay on his back, staring at the sky, then at the hole, then at the smoking stick. A slow, terrifying grin spread across his face. "By the gods, do it again!" But as he got to his feet, Amaury rushed past him, his face pale. He was looking at Solène. She was clutching her cheek a few feet away from the blast, and bright red blood was trickling through her fingers. When the stick had fired, a piece of unburned powder or a tiny fragment of the iron pan had shot sideways, striking her. She pulled her hand away. It was a shallow cut, but it was ugly, starting at her cheekbone and ending just below her eye. It would scar. She just looked at Amaury, her eyes wide, and then she too began to laugh. It was a wild, giddy, slightly hysterical laugh. "A mark of progress, master," she cheered, touching the wound with a sooty finger, smearing the blood. "Now we know to add a flash guard to the pan." But Amaury felt no joy. He saw the blood. He saw the scar that this bright, beautiful girl would carry for the rest of her life because of him, because of his monster. He grabbed her by the shoulders, his voice shaking with a sudden cold terror. "I promised your father I would keep you safe," he whispered, his own hand shaking. This is not safe." Solène's smile faded. She saw the horror in his eyes. "Master," she said, her voice firm, "we are at war. Safe left us 3 months ago. Now we must be strong." But he would never forget that moment. It was a promise he had already broken.
The day of the royal demonstration was a disaster. The full moon was 1 week away. King Leonce and his entire war council gathered in the quarry to see the salvation Amaury had promised. Amaury had 50 sticks and a hastily trained squad of Sergeant Odon's men. The men were nervous. They had fired the weapons, yes, but they were still unpredictable. The powder was sensitive to moisture, and it had rained the night before. Amaury could feel the dampness in the air, a clammy hand of dread on his heart. "First rank, present!" Odin bellowed. The 20 soldiers raised their sticks. They looked clumsy, absurd. One of the lords, Duke Eudoxy, a man who worshipped elven culture, laughed openly. "They look like they're holding broomsticks, your majesty. Are they to sweep the elves to death?" "Fire!" Odin roared. The men pulled their triggers. The result was a pathetic, staggered series of fizzles, pops, and puffs of smoke. One stick fired correctly, sending its ball smashing into the quarry wall. 2 others fired late, a terrifying second after the trigger was pulled. 3 more didn't fire at all, the damp powder in their pans just hissing uselessly, and one stick exploded. The barrel, cast with a flaw he had missed, burst apart, showering the soldiers in shrapnel. The man holding it screamed and fell, his arm a ruin of blood and splintered wood. It was a catastrophe. The lords were aghast. Duke Eudoxie looked pale. "You call this a weapon?" he spat at Amaury. "It's a suicide machine. You would send our men to die holding this junk?" The king's face was ashen. The gamble had failed. Amaury's world collapsed. He saw the wounded soldier being dragged away screaming. He saw the smirking lords. He saw the king's despair. All his work, all his genius, all of Solène's brilliance, for nothing. He fell to his knees in the mud, defeated. But as the lords began to usher the king away, Solène ran forward. She was carrying the prototype, the first stick they had ever built, the one she had perfected. She had kept it clean, dry, and separate. "Wait!" she yelled, her voice cracking with desperation. She ran to the firing line, her face a mask of furious tears. "It's the damp! It's the new barrels! It's not the idea! Look!" Before Amaury could stop her, she rammed home a charge, a ball, primed the pan with her own dry powder horn, and aimed at the elven-style shield they had set up 100 yards away. She didn't wait for an order. She just pulled the trigger. The crack was clean, sharp, and perfect. The boom echoed with authority, and the elven shield, crafted with ancient spells to ward off arrows, shattered into a dozen pieces. The quarry fell silent. All eyes were on Solène, a slip of a girl in a blacksmith's apron, standing in a cloud of her own smoke, the heavy, smoking stick held firmly in her hands. She was trembling, but her eyes were blazing. "It works," she whispered, her voice carrying in the dead silence. You have to trust it." King Leonce stopped. He looked at the destroyed shield. He looked at the wounded man. He looked at the 50 failed sticks. And then he looked at the one perfect shot from the one perfect weapon. He saw the raw, brutal power of it. He saw the risk. He saw the cost. And he saw that he had no other choice. He turned to the stunned council. "Duke Eudoxie," the king said, his voice quiet, but now filled with a cold iron, "you will be silent." He walked over to Amaury, still kneeling in the mud, and pulled him to his feet. "Master Smith, you have 6 days. Forget the 50. Make me 500. Make them all like hers." Amaury, his heart hammering, looked at Solène, who was watching him with a fierce, burning pride. He saw the scar on her cheek, stark and red. He saw the smoking crater where the shield had been. He saw the blood in the mud from his wounded soldier. He was a smith. He was an artisan. He was a man who had only ever wanted to create. And his king had just ordered him to build an arsenal. "Yes, Your Majesty," Amaury said, his voice hollow. "I will." The lords were silent. The gallows humor was gone. This was no longer a joke. This was a desperate, terrifying, and very real war. The forge was no longer a forge, it was a hell. Amaury, driven by a cold, obsessive fury, transformed the entire smithing quarter of the city into a weapons factory. He shut down the horseshoe makers, the plowsmiths, the armorers. Every bellows, every anvil, every pair of hands was now dedicated to building the sticks. He and Solène slept in shifts, their meals a piece of bread chewed over a blueprint. The smell of sulfur, charcoal, and hot iron hung over the city like a shroud. The work was brutal and dangerous. Every barrel had to be cast, bored, and pressure tested. Every matchlock mechanism had to be filed by hand. Every grain of black sand had to be precisely corned and dried. The soldiers were terrified. Sergeant Odon had been given command of this new, untested Thunder Corps, and his men were one step from mutiny. They were used to swords, to the clean thud of an arrow, the shing of steel. This was different.
This was alchemical. It felt like black magic. They handled the powder horns as if they were live snakes. "You're telling me," one soldier, a young man named Perrin, said to Odon, his voice shaking, "that I put fire next to this while I'm holding it? Are you mad?" Odon, his own shoulder still a mass of purple bruising, just growled, "You're mad if you don't. You ever seen what an elven force bolt does to a man? I have. It turns you inside out. I'll take a sore shoulder over that any day. Now load." The gallows humor returned, darker this time. The soldiers started naming their sticks. "I call this one the Elven Laugh, because that's what they'll do when they see it. I call mine the Widowmaker, but I'm not sure whose widow." Amaury, walking the lines, heard it all. The doubt was a poison seeping into the very iron he was forging. He pushed himself harder, his eyes bloodshot, his hands raw. He was not just fighting the elves, he was fighting time, physics, and the terror of his own men. He needed them to believe. Solène, meanwhile, had become a different person. The eager apprentice was gone, replaced by a ruthless quartermaster. She was the one who sourced the saltpeter when the caves ran dry, trading her mother's locket for a barrel of it on the black market. She was the one who drilled the men, her high, clear voice cutting through their fear. "You are not holding a stick," she would scream at them pacing the line. "You are holding thunder. You are holding the one thing in this world that perfect elven magic cannot stop. Load it like you mean it. Fire it like you hate them." The men, at first shocked by the slip of a girl, began to respect her. She had the scar to prove she'd bled for this. She believed, and her belief was more infectious than their fear. One night, Amaury found her asleep over a workbench, her head pillowed on a pile of oily rags, a half-finished lock mechanism still clutched in her hand. He looked at her, so young, so brilliant, and so tired. He felt a wave of crushing guilt. He was a master smith. He was supposed to be teaching her how to make things of beauty, gates with iron flowers, armor that fit like a glove. Instead, he had taught her how to make a thing that existed only to kill. He gently took the lock from her hand and covered her with his own heavy cloak. He saw the scar on her cheek, pale in the moonlight. "I'm sorry, Solène. I'm so sorry." He turned and went back to the forge, the rhythm of the hammers his only prayer. He had to make this work. He had to make her sacrifice, her scar, mean something. He would not let her down.
The rumors of what was happening in Braille-la-Forêt were dismissed by the Elven High Command as human hysterics. "They are forging more orc splitters, no doubt," Lord Thibault had said, bored at his council meeting. "They are loud, crude, and ultimately useless. Let them clang their metal. It is the death rattle of a primitive race." But one of his captains, a younger, more curious elf named Fyalar, was not so sure. He had heard tales from merchant spies of a strange, acrid smell over the city, of the forges running day and night, of the king's quarry being sealed by royal decree. "Arrogance is a luxury, my lord," Fyalar had dared to say. "Let me go and see these toys for myself. Let me confirm their uselessness." Thibault, annoyed at the interruption, had waved a dismissive hand. "Fine, go. But do not bore me with tales of human ingenuity. There is no such thing." Fyalar was a master of silent movement. He slipped into the human kingdom as easily as a shadow, his elven cloak making him invisible in the tanglewood. He bypassed the city and went straight to the place the rumors spoke of, the quarry. He watched from a high ridge, hidden, for a full day. He saw nothing but nervous human soldiers marching, drilling, and dropping things. He was about to leave, convinced Thibault was right, when a special squad marched into the quarry. They were led by a smith, a big bearded man, and a young scarred woman. They were carrying the sticks. Fyalar watched, intrigued, as they set up a target, a breastplate of the finest elven steel, one Fyalar himself had worn in skirmishes. It was enchanted to repel any physical arrow. Fyalar watched, as the scarred girl, Solène, barked orders. The soldiers loaded their sticks. Fyalar almost laughed. They were so clumsy. The process was painfully slow. They poured in powder, rammed in a ball. It took them almost a full minute. A single elven archer could lose 20 arrows in that time. This was indeed a joke.
Then the squad fired. The noise was the first shock. It was not the elegant thrum of a bow or the whisper of a spell. It was a physical assault, a concussive boom that shook the birds from the trees and made Fëalar's pointed ears ache. A great, stinking cloud of smoke obscured everything. Fëalar sneered. A weapon that blinded its wielder. Pathetic. Then the smoke cleared. Fëalar's sneer froze on his face. He stared at the elven breastplate. His blood ran cold. The breastplate was gone. It had been pulverized. Where it had stood, there was only a splintered wooden post and a large black crater in the rock face behind it. Fëalar's immortal heart hammered against his ribs. The enchantment, the finest spells of Cerulean, had done nothing. This primitive human weapon had not been stopped by the magic. It had not been deflected. It had simply ignored it. It was a purely physical force, a base, brutal thing of chemistry and violence, and it had punched through 1,000 years of elven magical superiority without even slowing down. Fëalar stayed for another hour, his hands shaking. He watched the soldiers drill. He noted everything, the painfully slow reload time, the wild inaccuracy of most of the shots, the way the barrels grew hot, the way the sticks misfired in the damp. It was crude. It was unreliable. It was a mess. But the power was absolute. He slipped away, his mind reeling, and raced back to Cerulean. He knew with a certainty that chilled his immortal soul that the world was about to change forever. The temporary race had just created a weapon that could kill an eternal.
Fëalar burst into the gleaming crystal hall of Lord Theobald, his boots tracking mud onto the spotless, glowing floor. The elven lords and ladies of the council stopped their quiet, melodic chatter, looking at Fëalar with disdain. He was dirty, he was sweating, and he smelled of human smoke. "My Lord Theobald," Fëalar said, breathing hard, forgetting his decorum. "The humans, their weapon, it is not a joke. I saw it. It destroyed an enchanted breastplate. The magic did nothing." He spoke of the noise, the smoke, the terrifying, brutal power that had punched a hole in solid rock. He explained that this was not a weapon of magic, but a weapon of force, something their shields were not designed to stop. There was a long, perfect silence in the hall. Lord Theobald, who had been admiring the fall of light from a crystal chandelier, turned his head slowly. He looked at Fëalar, and his eyes were not concerned. They were bored. "Fëalar," Theobald said, his voice a silken drawl, "you are agitated. It is unbecoming." He rose from his crystal throne and glided over to the frantic captain. "So, the little mortals have found a way to make a louder rock thrower, a child's firecracker, and in your terror you have forgotten everything that makes us us, and them them." Theobald tapped a single long finger on Fëalar's chest. "You say it is slow, that it takes a full minute to reload?" Fëalar nodded dumbly. "Yes, my lord, at least." Theobald smiled. "In 1 minute, my archers will fire 20 arrows. Each one will find a human heart. You say it is inaccurate, that they spray their shot like a drunken man." "Yes, my lord, most missed the target entirely. My archers do not miss, ever." Theobald turned to the council, his arms open wide. "You see? They have created a toy that is loud, slow, inaccurate, and blinds them with smoke. And Fëalar, you say it is physical? That our shields, designed to stop the true power of magic, are not designed for it?" Theobald let out his cold, tinkling laugh. "My dear captain, what is a magical shield if not a wall of force? Do you think a lead ball can pass where a demon's claw cannot?
We are elves. Our magic is the fabric of the world. Their sticks are a novelty, an amusing, if smelly one. Let them bring their toys to the valley. It will be a fine diversion for the troops." The rest of the council, their composure regained, began to laugh with him. They were immortals. They had seen mountains rise and fall. The idea that a few hundred primitive, short-lived apes could challenge them with a tube, it was the funniest joke they had heard in a century. Phalar tried one last time. "My lord, the Force, I cannot explain it. It is not like anything I have ever seen. It is brutal. It is not our way." Theobald's eyes hardened, his boredom flashing into a momentary cold anger. "No, Captain Phalar, it is not our way. It is their way. It is ugly, it is clumsy, and it is desperate. It is the last pathetic fart of a dying race. You are dismissed. Go and wash the human stink from your armor." Phalar, humiliated and defeated, bowed low and backed out of the hall, the sound of their melodic, arrogant laughter following him down the crystal corridors. He knew then that the elves would not be defeated by human weapons. They would be defeated by their own pride.
The human city was not laughing. It was terrified. Amaury's thundercore was the talk of every tavern, and the talk was not kind. The soldiers, now numbering 500, were drilling in the main courtyard, and the entire city was forced to live with the constant, nerve-shredding crack of test fires, the smell of sulfur, and the sight of men being carried to the infirmary with powder burns or bruised shoulders. The gallows humor had turned sour. The people saw their sons and husbands being handed weapons that looked more dangerous to the wielder than to the enemy. This wasn't hope. This was a mass sacrifice, organized by a mad blacksmith. The greatest source of doubt came from Amaury's own brother, Captain Everard. Everard was a soldier, a sword and shield man, brave, pragmatic, and deeply protective of his men. He saw Amaury's obsession, the wild, haunted look in his eyes, and he saw a man driving them all off a cliff. He cornered Amaury in the forge late one night, shoving aside a crate of newly cast barrels. "Amaury, you have to stop," Everard pleaded, his voice rough with despair. "The men are terrified. They're calling them demon sticks. Half of them are having nightmares. You're not a general. You're a smith. You've built them a faster way to die." Amaury, his face gaunt from lack of sleep, didn't look up from the rifle groove he was meticulously filing. "They work, Everard. They will pierce elven magic. They explode. I saw 2 men lose fingers today. And the reload time? An elf will have put 3 arrows in your chest before you've even poured the powder. You're sending them to be slaughtered. All of them." Amaury's hand tightened on the file. "They will hold the line. They will break. The moment the elves' magic hits them, they will drop those cursed sticks and run, and I will be right there with them, trying to hold a line with swords against a storm of magic. You're killing us, brother, for your pride." That stung. Amaury finally looked up, his eyes burning with a cold, obsessive fire. "Pride? You think this is pride? I haven't slept in a month. I see Solène's scar in my nightmares. I see the blood of the man whose arm was ruined. This isn't pride, brother. It's math. They have magic, we have physics. Their magic is fast, but it is finite. It costs them energy. Our physics is brutal, but it is cheap. It just costs us black sand. We can make more noise than they can make magic. We can overwhelm them." Everard shook his head, his face a mask of tragedy. "You're mad. You're gambling with the lives of our entire army on an idea." He grabbed the front of Amaury's sooty tunic. "I am begging you, as your brother, tell the king it failed. Let us sue for peace. Let us give them the forest. A home lost can be rebuilt. A generation of dead men cannot." Amaury looked at his brother's desperate, honest face. He saw the love there, the fear.
And he knew with chilling certainty that Everard was a good man and that he was wrong. "I can't do that," Amaury whispered. "Get out of my forge, Captain." Everard stared at him, his heart breaking. He saw a stranger. He let go of his brother. "Then you are not my brother," Everard said, his voice dead. "You are just another madman sending us all to hell." He turned and walked out, leaving Amaury alone in the dark, with only the shing, shing, shing of his file for company.
The problem was accuracy. Amaury's 500 sticks were weapons of terror, not precision. They were designed to be fired in a volley, a wall of lead and smoke, to break a charge. But Amaury knew the elves wouldn't charge. They would stand off, at a distance, and rain magic down upon them. The smooth-bore barrels were wildly inaccurate. At 100 yards, a soldier was lucky to hit the wall of the quarry, let alone a single slender elf. The men knew it. "We're just going to be making loud noises at them," Odin had growled, spitting in the dust. "This is a fool's errand." The doubt was seeping back in, cold and damp, just like the rain that threatened to ruin their powder. Amaury was blocked. He paced the forge, despair eating at him. He had failed. Everard was right. He had built 500 noisy fireworks. It was Solène who broke the impasse. She wasn't a smith or a soldier. She was an observer. She had been watching the Fletchers, the men who made arrows, and she was fascinated by how they angled the feathers. "Why are they tilted, master?" she had asked him weeks ago. "To make the arrows spin," Amaury had answered distractedly. "It keeps it straight. It makes it true." Now, in the depths of his despair, Solène appeared of his workbench, her eyes blazing with that familiar brilliant light. She was holding a single, newly cast barrel. "Master," she said, her voice trembling, "you said the spin makes it true." He looked at her, not understanding. "For an arrow, yes, but a ball? A ball is a ball." "But what if it wasn't?" she said. She unrolled a charcoal sketch. It was a drawing of the inside of a barrel, but it wasn't smooth. There were grooves cut into it, spiraling down the length. "I was watching the river," she explained, talking fast. "The water in the center moves fast. The water on the edges moves slow. It tumbles. What if we make the ball grip the barrel? What if we force it to spin, just like the arrow?" Amaury stared at the drawing. It was impossible. The pressure, the friction, it would tear the barrel apart. It would never work. "It's too complex," he said. "We don't have time." "Then make time," she insisted, her voice rising. "Let me try. Just one. Let me ruin one barrel." Her intensity, her absolute certainty cut through his fog of doubt. He looked at her, this girl who had poured her entire soul into his monster, and he nodded. "One. We have time for one." For the next 12 hours, they worked without stopping. They couldn't cast the grooves. They had to cut them. They took a long steel rod, welded a hardened steel tooth to the end, and using a complex lever system of Amaury's own design, began the agonizing process of rifling the barrel. They would pull the rod through, shave off a curl of iron no thicker than a human hair, reset the tooth, and pull again. It was painstaking, exhausting work. At dawn, they had one barrel. It was flawed, the grooves were uneven, but it was rifled. They took it to the quarry, their hands shaking with fatigue. They loaded it. Amaury had painted a small red circle on the quarry wall, 200 yards out, twice the effective range of their other sticks. "This is madness," Amaury breathed. Solène, her face a pale mask of exhaustion and hope, just smiled. "Fire the demon, master." Amaury lit the match, put it to the pan, and pulled the trigger. The boom was deeper, more resonant. The smoke cleared. Amaury and Solène both stared. The lead ball had struck the wall not 5 inches from the red circle. A perfect shot. Amaury felt the world tilt. This changed everything. This was not a weapon of terror. This was a scalpel. It was a sniper. It was a tool that could reach out and kill a single target from a distance no elven arrow could ever match. He turned to Solène, his heart pounding. "My God, girl! What have you done?"
Solène just grinned, her scar bright in the dawn light. "I made it true, master." But the triumph was cold. They looked at the forge where 500 smooth-bore sticks sat waiting. They had time to make perhaps 50 of these new, true ones. Not an army, just a handful. Just a hope.
The creation of the rifled sticks became the forge's most guarded secret. Amaury designated a hidden secondary workshop, and he and Solène worked there alone, their hands bleeding from the frantic, repetitive work of cutting the grooves. They managed to complete 62 of them, 62 true sticks, as the smiths began to call them, in a sea of 500 crude thunder pipes. They were not enough to win the war, but Amaury knew they were not meant to win the war. They were meant to end it. They were not for ranks of soldiers. They were for commanders. They were for mages. They were for arrogant elven lords who thought they were safe from 100 yards away. Amaury knew he couldn't give these complex weapons to just any soldier. He needed the best. He needed men who were calm, who had ice in their veins, who were expert hunters, and who were stubborn enough to believe in the impossible. He, Solène, and Sergeant Odin handpicked a new unit. They were a motley crew. Poachers, city watchmen, grizzled trackers, and, to Amaury's hawk, several women from the city's fletching guild who understood wind and trajectory better than any man. They were 62 soldiers, and they were given the 62 rifled sticks. Odin, with his dark sense of humor, named them the Forlorn Hope, because, he'd growled, if they fail, our hope is forlorn. Then came the confrontation he had been dreading. Solène, who had supervised the training, who knew the true sticks better than even Amaury, who could load and fire one in 45 seconds, confronted him in the forge. "I'm joining them," she said. It was not a request. Amaury stopped his work. "No. I'm the best shot we have, master. I hit the red circle. Odin can't even hit the wall with it." "I said no, Solène. You're an apprentice. You're a girl," he stammered, horrified. "I'm a scientist," she shot back, her eyes flashing, "and I am a soldier, just like you. You think you can stand on that hill and give the order, but I'm the one who has to make it work. I'm the one who designed the rifling. This is my weapon, Amaury. You will not keep me from it." He grabbed her, his voice a low, desperate plea. I promised I would keep you safe. I promised your father. I saw what that stick did to your face. What if one of these explodes? These new ones, there are more pressure, more danger. I cannot send you to your death." She met his gaze, and her eyes were not the eyes of a child. They were hard, cold, and clear, just like his brother's. "You are not my keeper, Amaury. You are my master, and you taught me that we must see a job through to the end. I am not asking you as your apprentice. I am telling you, as the best marksman in this army, I will be in that unit, or I will take my stick and I will fight on my own." He stared at her, this brilliant, stubborn, terrifying girl he had come to see as a daughter. He saw the scar, her badge of honor. He saw the iron in her spine, and he knew, with a sinking, tragic finality, that he had taught her too well. He had given her a purpose, and he could not take it away. He let go of her, his hands dropping to his sides, defeated. "You will stay by Odin," he whispered, his voice thick. "You will not be on the front line. You will just be there." Solène knew she had won. She nodded, her expression softening. "I will be careful," she lied. Amaury turned away, unable to look at her. He unfastened a small silver sigil from his own jerkin, the badge of his rank as Master Artificer. He pressed it into her hand. If I fall," he said, "this proves the invention was yours." She clutched it, her eyes filling with tears. "It was ours, master." The march to the Valley of Sighs was a portrait of misery. The human army of Brie-la-Forêt was not a shining legion. It was 5,000 men, farmers and smiths and tanners, carrying pikes they barely knew how to use, and, at their center, the 500-strong Thunder Corps, who smelled of sulfur and fear. It rained. Of course it rained. A cold, miserable drizzle that soaked their woolen cloaks and, more importantly, threatened to dampen their precious black sand.
Amaury and Solène were in a constant state of frantic panic, supervising the waterproofing of the powder horns with beeswax and oiled leather. The gallows humor of the soldiers reached a fever pitch. "I've got a new name for my stick," one soldier, Perrin, muttered to his friend, his teeth chattering. "I call it the elf tickler, because that's all this damp fizzle powder's gonna do." "At least you have a stick," his friend replied, hefting a long, heavy pike. "I'm in the get-poked-by-magic brigade. My only job is to stand here and die so you have time to reload your fizzle stick." Sergeant O'Don, riding his horse up and down the line, was a force of pure, grumpy terror. "Keep your powder dry and your heads down," he'd roar. "The elves expect you to be terrified. They expect you to be wet and miserable. Good. Let them. Surprising them will be all the sweeter. Now march, you pathetic excuses for men." Amaury rode near the front, beside King Leonce. The king looked old, his crown sitting uneasily on his brow. "They look so primitive, Amaury," the king whispered, watching his own army slog through the mud. "And the smell. We smell like a volcano. The elves will know we're coming from a mile away." Amaury nodded, his face grim. "Let them, your majesty. Let them smell us. Let them hear us. They think we are animals. It's time we showed them what kind of animals we are." But privately, Amaury was consumed by doubt. His brother, Evrod, was leading the cavalry, and he hadn't spoken a single word to Amaury since their fight in the forge. The army was divided. The men were scared. The weapons were unreliable. Solène, meanwhile, was with her forlorn hope. They were marching as a separate unit, their 62 true sticks meticulously wrapped in oiled cloth. She was a different person, all business and cold efficiency. She was drilling her soldiers as they marched. "Reload!" she'd shout, and her squad would, in the rain, practice the complex 20-step process of loading their weapons on the move. Misfire, clear the pan, reprime, fire! They were becoming a machine, a slow, clumsy machine, but a machine nonetheless. They were earning her respect. They had stopped seeing her as a girl. They had started calling her the Scarred. The contrast with the Elven lands was a physical blow. One moment they were in the Tanglewood, a normal, chaotic human forest full of mud and rotting leaves. The next, they passed between two ancient white trees, and they were in Cerulean. The forest floor was a perfect mossy carpet. The trees were ancient, silver-barked giants that seemed to hum with a low, magical energy. The air was clean, sweet, and sterile. There was no mud. Even the rain seemed to fall more gently here. The human soldiers, with their stink and their noise, felt like a blight. They felt like the primitive animals the elves called them. Don't touch anything," one soldier whispered, looking at a flower that glowed with its own inner light. "It's probably cursed." The arrogance of the elves was in the very air they breathed. It made Amaury's hatred burn cold and bright.
They made camp at the edge of the Valley of Sighs. It was a wide, open bowl of land, perfect for a civilized battle, which meant it was a perfect killing field. The elves were already there, encamped on the far ridge, a mile away. Their camp was not a camp, it was a city. It was a collection of glowing silk pavilions lit by magical floating orbs. The sound of melodic singing drifted across the valley, a sound so beautiful it made the human soldiers' hearts ache. There was no soot from the elven camp. There were no latrine pits. It was a vision of perfection. The human camp, by contrast, was a muddy, smoky, stinking sprawl of damp tents and nervous, coughing men. Amaury stood on the ridge, looking at the elven lights, the weight of the world on him. He was a blacksmith. He was supposed to be at home, hammering a horseshoe, not commanding an army in a war he had personally armed. He felt a presence beside him. It was Solène. She was wrapped in a heavy cloak, her face pale in the moonlight. For a moment, she wasn't the Scarred, the ruthless commander. She was just a girl, and she was terrified. They're beautiful," she whispered, looking at the elven camp. "It feels wrong to want to break something so beautiful." Amaury knew what she meant. He felt it too, the pull of that perfection. "They are beautiful, Solène," he said, his voice low. "But so is a wolf, So is a forest fire. Their beauty is predatory. It lives by consuming us, our ugliness, our soot, our sweat. That is the price of freedom. That is the price of progress. He looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred, and black with grease. They have their magic. We have our minds. We have our hands. And tomorrow, we will show them which one is stronger. She leaned her head on his shoulder, just for a moment. I'm scared, Master. I know, he breathed. I am too. He wanted desperately to send her away, to order her back to the city, back to safety, but he knew he couldn't. He knew she would rather die here than live as a primitive slave. She was the new generation. She was the human spirit he was fighting for, stubborn, brilliant, reckless, and brave. Get some rest, Solène, he said gently, pushing her away. Your hope needs you sharp tomorrow. She nodded, clutching the silver sigil he had given her, which she now wore on a chain around her neck. Yes, Master. She walked back to her tent, a small dark shape against the impossible beauty of the elven lights. Amaury did not sleep. He walked the camp. He saw his brother, Everard, sharpening his sword, his face a mask of stone. Everard looked up as he passed. Their eyes met. There was no forgiveness there, just a cold, shared dread. Amaury walked to the Thundercore. The men were clustered around low fires, cleaning their sticks with meticulous care, their gallows humor gone, replaced by a grim, fatalistic silence. Sergeant Odin was sitting on a powder keg, a dark joke in itself, chewing on a piece of dried meat. Rain stopped, Smith, Odin grunted. That's something. It's something, Amaury agreed. Are they ready? Odin spat. They're terrified. They're angry. They're about to fight gods with crackers. Ready doesn't mean a damn thing. But they'll hold. They'll hold because they hate those perfect singing bastards more than they fear your sticks. That'll have to be enough. The dawn was cold and gray. The Valley of Sighs was filled with a low-lying mist, making the world feel hushed and unreal. The human army assembled, their leather armor damp, their faces pale. They were a line of mud and iron. Across the valley, the Elven army assembled. It was like watching a sunrise. They moved with a silent, liquid grace, their silver armor gleaming, their blue banners unfurling in a wind that didn't seem to touch the human side of the field. There were no shouts, no clumsy formations, just perfect, silent, deadly beauty. At their head, on a magnificent white elk, was Lord Theobald, his starlight armor so bright it seemed to pierce the mist. This was the moment. This was the cold open, but now it was real, and Amaury was living it. He stood at the front, his heart a cold, heavy stone in his chest. Theobald rode his elk forward, the creature's hooves making no sound on the wet grass. He stopped 150 yards away, well out of longbow range, and looked at the human army with an expression of profound, almost sad disappointment. And then his eyes fell on the front rank, Odin's Thundercore, and their crude black iron sticks. And he laughed. The sound was high and clear like breaking glass, and it was filled with such utter contemptuous mirth that it cut the human soldiers deeper than any sword. His laugh was magically amplified, echoing across the valley. General Amaury, Theobald called out, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. You were told to bring tribute, not firewood. Are you so primitive you believe you can frighten us with noise and smoke? You mortals are even duller than I imagined. This is not a child's festival. This is a battlefield. The elven lines, a perfect, shimmering wall, rippled with the same cold laughter. The humiliation was a physical thing, a hot, sour taste in every human mouth. Amaury saw his brother, Everard, grip his sword hilt, his face white with rage. He saw his men falter, their belief crumbling. He saw the terror in their eyes. This was the moment, the breaking point. He looked to his forlorn hope, hidden on the flank on a small wooded hill. He saw Solène, a small figure, her rifled true stick resting on a rock, aimed not at the army, but at the laughing elven lord. Her face was calm, focused. She was waiting. Amaury turned his gaze back to Theobald. The elven lord was still smiling. "Come, little mortal," Theobald sighed, raising one perfect gauntleted hand. "Show me your trick, and then we will cleanse this valley of your filth." Behind him, the elven mages raised their staffs, and the air began to thrum with a gathering, terrifying power. The air grew cold. The light began to dim. Amaury knew with a chilling certainty that he had perhaps 10 seconds to live. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his heart hammering, and he raised his unadorned steel sword.
The world held its breath. The elven mages began their chant, a low, discordant harmony that vibrated in the teeth. A blue, crackling energy began to form in the air above them, a gathering storm of magical force. They were preparing a single, massive spell, a wave of power designed to shatter the entire human front line. Thibaud watched, his smirk fixed, waiting for the inevitable. He had seen this spell 100 times. It was art. "Now," Amaury whispered, his voice lost in the magical hum. But Odin, at the front, heard him. "First rank!" Odin screamed, his voice cracking with pure, desperate fury. "Present!" 250 men raised their sticks. The elves watched, amused. "Fire!" The world exploded. It was not one bang. It was 250 bangs, all at once, a single, deafening, rolling crack of thunder that was not magic, not art, but pure, physical violence. A solid wall of white, stinking smoke instantly obscured the entire human line. The ground shook. The magical energy gathering above the elves faltered as the sheer concussive force, the sound wave alone, hit their lines. The elven mages, their concentration broken by the physicality of the blast, staggered. Their spell dissolved into harmless sparks. And then, a heartbeat later, the lead arrived. It was not a shot. It was a wall of metal. 250 half-pound lead balls fired with no accuracy, but with monstrous, brute force. They tore through the 150-yard gap in less than a second. The elven front line, the mages, the lightly armored archers, had been standing in perfect, arrogant formation. Their perfect magical shields, woven to stop arrows, to deflect swords, to dissipate magic, were utterly useless. They were not designed for this. They were not designed for physics. The lead balls, simple, primitive lumps of metal, punched through the magical wards as if they were wet paper. The result was not a battle. It was a slaughter. The front rank of the elven army vanished. They didn't fall. They were shredded, turned into a red mist, their perfect bodies torn apart by the sheer kinetic fury of the human weapon. There was a moment of perfect, profound silence. The human soldiers, blinded by their own smoke, had no idea what had happened. The surviving elves, their ears ringing, their eyes wide with a terror their immortal souls had never known, just stared. The laughter was gone. Thibaud's smirk was gone, frozen on his face in a mask of utter, uncomprehending shock. And in that moment of silence, a second volley of cracks echoed from the hill on the flank. The forlorn hope. The 62 rifled sticks. This was not a wall of lead. This was a scalpel. 62 shots. 62 targets. Across the field, elven captains, banner-bearers, and mages who had survived the first blast suddenly and silently fell. Thibaud looked down. A new red hole had appeared in the chest of his beautiful white elk.
The creature shuddered and fell, dead. That broke the spell. The elves, who had not known fear in 1,000 years, who had never seen their perfect magic fail, who had never seen their commanders die, panicked. Their formation, their perfect discipline, shattered. They were just mortals. They screamed, they dropped their perfect weapons, and they ran. They ran from the noise, they ran from the smoke, they ran from the primitive apes who had somehow, impossibly, harnessed the thunder. Amaury stood, shaking in the smoke, as his brother Everard, his face a mask of awe, galloped past, his sword raised. "Charge!" Everard roared, leading the cavalry into the fleeing, broken elven lines. The victory was total. It was bloody. It was ugly. It was not glorious at all, but it was theirs.
The smoke began to clear, revealing the horrifying, brutal painting of the victory. The Valley of Sighs was a butcher's yard. The perfect elves were broken, scattered, and dead, their beautiful armor stained with mud and blood. The human army, at first stunned into silence by the sheer, unbelievable fact of their survival, let out a staggered, ragged cheer. It grew into a deafening roar. They had won. They had faced gods, and the gods had bled. They had run. Men were weeping, laughing, firing their sticks into the air in joy. King Leonci fell to his knees, his hands clasped in prayer. Everard galloped back to Amaury, his face splattered with elven blood, his eyes wide with a new, terrified respect. "Brother," he breathed. "My God, brother!" But Amaury was not listening. His heart, which had been frozen with terror, was now a lump of ice. He was counting. He was counting the shots from the forlorn hope. He had heard 62, but they were supposed to fire in volleys. He was scanning the wooded hill, his eyes frantic. Where was her? He began to run, shoving aside cheering soldiers, his lungs burning. "Solène!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. "Solène!" He ran up the small hill, his dread a cold sickness in his stomach. The forlorn hope were there, reloading, their faces grim but triumphant. "Master!" one of them cheered. "Did you see it? We... Amaury pushed past him, and then he saw her. She was on the ground, a few feet from her firing position. She was not hit by an elf. There was no elven arrow, no mark of magic. She was burned. The true stick lay beside her, the barrel split open, the wooden stock shattered. It had burst. The new rifle design, the one that created more pressure, the one that was his idea, refined by her, it had been flawed. It had been one too many. The sheer stress of the battle, a hairline crack he had missed, a fraction too much powder in her haste, it had exploded. It had taken her. He fell to his knees beside her. She was still alive, barely. Her face was a ruin, the scar he had obsessed over now lost in a map of terrible new wounds. The silver sigil he had given her, the one she wore for luck, was melted into her tunic. "Master," she whispered, her voice a wet, bloody rattle. She coughed, and blood flecked her lips. Did we... "We won, Solène," Amaury choked, gathering her into his arms, tears streaming down his sooty face, cutting clean paths through the grime. "We won. They ran. You did it. You did it." A faint, terrible smile touched her lips. It worked, then. Her eyes, those brilliant, blazing eyes, went dull. She was gone. Amaury just knelt there, holding her small, broken body, his mind a perfect hollow void. The cheers of the army in the valley below sounded distant, like the buzzing of insects. He was dimly aware of Odon standing beside him, the old sergeant's face crumpled in grief. Amaury just shook his head, rocking Solène's body. His promise to her, "I will keep you safe," echoing in his silent, shattered mind. He had won. He had saved his people. He had given them thunder. And the price?
The price was this. The price was her. He was still holding her, his shoulders shaking in a silent, agonizing scream, when a new sound cut through the cheers. A horn. A low, deep, dwarven horn echoing from the iron peaks to the north. A single terrified scout, his horse lathered, galloped up the hill, his eyes wide with a new, fresh terror. "General Amaury! General!" the scout screamed, not even seeing the body in his arms. "The dwarfs! Their army is on the move! The mountain clans, they heard the thunder! They're marching on Brie-la-Forêt! They say they want the sand!"